Well, welcome to our next lesson in the book of Deuteronomy. Today we're going to cover the fifth commandment in the 10 commandments, and this is the commandment to honor your parents, honor your mother and your father. And we're going to take a look at this subject. We've really broken it down into two different categories here. The first one is the responsibility of children towards their parents, and the second category is the responsibility of parents toward their children. We're going to try to cover both of these. The first thing that we find in the 10 Commandments, we look there in the book of Deuteronomy, and it says, children, honor your parents. Honor your parents. And it would be right for us to ask, what does it mean by honoring? What does that involve? And I've listed here some words I think that will help us to get a better or fuller understanding of what it means. We get to the first word I've got listed here is revere. Well, in Leviticus chapter 19, it admonishes children to respect, or it's sometimes translated revere, your parents. And so we're responsible to show reverence to our parents. And then there's the word obey. Obey. And when we get to the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 6, it tells us, it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Obey your parents in the Lord. So to honor does, in the case of a minor, does require us to obey. And then there's this concept of thankfulness, and I've got it listed over here, care as well. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 4 and verse 8, it admonishes the adult child to go back and take care of their parents, to provide physical care for a widow or an older parent. And it says, in so doing, you will pay them back for the good they've already done in your life. Well, this is a sense of gratitude, right? This is a sense of thankfulness for what mom and dad have already done. Respect, which is very similar to revere, and deference, and showing that the parent is important and significant. Now, if a young person isn't doing these things, if they're moving through the household and they don't have any deference for mom and dad, they have disrespect for one of them, they don't treat them as though they are significant in their lives. Well, this is the opposite of honoring. This is dishonoring your parents. And we're told that honoring our parents and obeying mom and dad as a child pleases the Lord. Well, I think we're left to conclude that if we dishonor our parents, that is displeasing to the Lord. Displeasing to the Lord. Now we move over to the Gospels here. We get to the Gospel of Luke, and it tells us about Jesus when he's 12 years old. He goes down to Jerusalem with his parents. There's a little mix-up about him getting lost, and from there it tells us he goes back to Nazareth with mom and dad, and he obeys his parents. It explicitly says he obeys his parents. And so Jesus is our example. Now remember, he's 12 years old. And I can picture some 12-year-olds who would suggest that they're not responsible to obey mom and dad. In fact, they might give a very disrespectful response to a request from mom and dad. And here we have Jesus demonstrating, 12 years old, no, he's still obeying mom and dad. And then, we've already mentioned this, but in Colossians 3:20, it tells us that this pleases the Lord. This pleases the Lord to honor and obey our parents. And so I have some people who come to me and say, well, I'd really like to live a life pleasing to the Lord, but it's a mystery to me. I really don't know what pleases the Lord. And it may be true that there are some things that are hard to discern, but here it's very clear. He tells us, honor your parents, obey your parents, and this will be pleasing to God. You will see a delight in God. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16, he says to the people of Israel, honor your mother and father, and, so that it will go well with you, and that you might live long in the land. So this is a promise that's made to the Israelites under the Old Covenant, that when they went into the land of Canaan, if they were obedient to their parents, honoring to their parents, that God would then return blessing on them. And you might say, well, is that only applicable under the Old Covenant? Well, if we move forward to Ephesians chapter 6, he tells us, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then he quotes it, honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. He inserts that phrase. This is the first commandment with a promise. And then he finishes the quote, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. So what do we teach our children? Do we teach our children that God is going to give them blessing if they obey in this area? And I think the answer is yes. I think that's what God intends to say. That was true under the Old Covenant, and that is true under the New Covenant. God will bring blessing in a person's life if they are obedient and honoring to mother and father. Now, there are lots of different ways, some very obvious ways that God brings a blessing into the life of a young person who is obedient and honoring to their parents. And a very obvious way is that they will avoid negative consequences for their sin. Why? Well, because mother and father will teach them not to sin. Teach them not to sin, and consequently, they won't end up going to prison. They won't end up getting injured, right? If they learn not to sin, many good things will happen in their lives. But I think in addition to avoiding negative consequences, God is saying, I'm willing to bring additional blessing into your life. I'm willing to bestow on you my favor in a special sort of way if you will just honor and obey your mother and your father. Now, some people might argue, well, okay, that applied to the nation of Israel before they entered the land of Canaan, and we can see that it applies to the church when we get to Ephesians chapter 6, but maybe that's where it stops. It doesn't actually apply to anybody else, and I would say, no, that's incorrect. In the book of Romans and the book of 2 Timothy and 1 Timothy, we get these lists of sins that the general public have committed. And he uses it, Paul uses this as an indictment against them, saying that God will bring judgment on people for these violations. Well, among them are disobedience to your parents or violence to your parents. And so from these three passages, it tells us, no, this is the standard that God is applying to all people at all times in all places. Everybody is expected to honor their parents. And then we need to make sure we understand. So Jesus says, no, look, anybody who loves mother and father more than they love me is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven. Our allegiance toward our parents, which is strong and should be strong, it's a good thing. That's what brings about the honoring. Our allegiance to our parents should never exceed our allegiance to God. Now, when's that going to happen? Well, it's only going to happen when mom and dad's direction differs from God's direction. And so if we have a mother and a father who don't know the Lord, and a young person who does and is living in their home, and mother and father instruct the child to sin, that child is responsible to abide by God's standards. And in that point, you would have to diverge from mother and father's direction. But within a Christian home, that shouldn't happen, right? Mom and dad should be in sync with what God is doing in the lives of everybody in the family. So that's an instruction that Jesus wants us to know. Our allegiance to God must always exceed our allegiance to our parents. He tells us in Mark chapter 7 that we have an obligation to our parents. So this is the instance where the Pharisees had told people, look, and I think it was a money-making scheme, they told people, look, if you give money, if you donate money to the temple, then you're absolved of your obligations towards mom and dad. So whatever you were going to give to mom and dad, just give it over to the temple, and then you don't have to worry about mom and dad. And Jesus comes down pretty hard on that, and he says, no. You are obligated to honor and care for your mother and father. And you can't say, well, I'm no longer responsible for this because I had some religious activity over here, and therefore this satisfies my requirement toward mom and dad. That is not true. And Jesus wants us to understand that. And then finally, some people will say, well, yes, we're all required to honor our mother and our father, but we're also all required to obey mom and dad, even after we are adults living outside of our home. And this is sometimes brought up by parents wanting an adult child to obey them. And I would say, no, I think that's an incorrect understanding of a couple of different passages. The first one I think we need to go back to is Genesis chapter 2. It tells us that a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And the concept here is that not just that they're moving out of the house, but that they're moving out from under that position of authority and establishing a new authority structure. And yes, we're obligated as adults to honor our mother and father, but not obligated to obey mom and dad. And mom and dad should respect that. And we should, as parents, respect that of our adult children. Now, some people will point to Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 3, and say, well, it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And so, therefore, doesn't that apply to us? And I think, again, it's a misunderstanding about the passage. It starts in Ephesians chapter 5, around verse 22, and moves all the way through about halfway through chapter 6. And what it does is it is addressed to all of the church, but it has couplets of subcategories, right? So it talks about a husband and a wife, and it talks about Christ and his bride, and it talks about fathers and children. It talks about masters and servants, slaves. And each of these are a relationship couplet, right? One is in authority and one is in submission to the other. And he deliberately brings these together in pairs for us. And these are all subcategories of the church. Not any one of them applies to all of the church. So, like, not everybody is a wife, or not everybody is a husband, not everybody is a master, not everybody is a servant, right? And not everybody is a father, and not everybody is a minor child, right? And so that's how we need to understand that. And if he wanted to do it differently, if he wanted that statement to apply to adults as well, he could have made that clear by simply bringing it out of that pattern. There is a portion at the beginning. It says, all of you submit to one another. And he could have said right there, all of you honor your mother and father, or obey your mother and father. He doesn't. He could have dropped the word children and just said, obey your mother and father. And that would have applied to everybody. He doesn't do that. Instead, he's got it coupled with a parent and a child. And this child would be a minor child. Good, so that is, obedience is expected from minors. Now, one might ask the question, well, when am I no longer a minor? In our country, we've defined a minor as between 18 and 21, depends on what it is that they will or will not allow a person to do. But, the Bible differed on this as well. Young men were not considered to be full-grown adults till they were 30, 31 years old. When is a child no longer a child? It is, I think, that we need to be careful and make that assessment not by age, but by development of the child, right? And we come to a corporate agreement and say, no, you're not quite ready, or yes, you're already ready. Okay, so we talked about responsibility of children towards parents. Now we move on to responsibility of parents towards children, right? So it's the inverse of that. And I've got 4 points here. One is love, patience, discipline, and instruction. I'd like to move through each of these. Love, in Luke chapter 11, verse 13, Jesus tells a story. He says, if you, a father, love your child and know how to give good gifts to them, how much more does your Father in heaven love you and know how to give good gifts to you? The assumption is dad already loves the child. The same kind of assumption is in Psalm 103. The point is that fathers and mothers are expected to express love toward their children. Now, let's make sure we understand that the Bible's definition of love differs greatly from the world's definition of love, right? The world's definition of love is, if it makes me emotionally satisfied, then I call that love. that's love from me toward them. If it makes me emotionally satisfied. And that's not at all what the Bible talks about. The Bible talks about me deciding to do what's best for another person. That's love. That's love. So I intend to do what's best for the other person. Then you can say that you love the other person. And so that's what we're supposed to have for our children. We move on to patience, right? So being a parent, if you're a parent, you understand this. It demands some amount of patience. Why? Well, because our child is going to make mistakes, and we have to respond in an appropriate manner. We can't be overly harsh, nor can we be overly permissive. Overly harsh will drive our child into submission, and eventually they will either break, and that is they'll have no will of their own, or they will rebel entirely. You won't, in the long run, get the outcome that you're looking for. And we need to not be overly permissive, right? So the person that says, well, I don't really care what they do. I'm going to let them express themselves. That's what's good for them, right? And the fact is that our children long for our involvement in their lives and the discipline, which is going to bring us to the next point, but the fence around their life. They long for that. And they will act out until they get it, right? So we as parents need to be patient and be neither overly harsh nor overly permissive. That brings us to our next point, discipline, right? And in 1 Timothy and in Titus, it gives a list of requirements if you're going to be a leader within the church. And it says one of the requirements is that you have obedient children. And what it means is that if you're going to be entrusted with training people in the body of Christ, let's see that you've demonstrated that in your own family. You've trained people in your own family. And so there should be obedient children in your family, and our discipline is intended to bring that about. Notice that the point is not to have my way. The point is not to exhaust my anger. The point is not to vent, right? The point is to bring about a certain kind of behavior. The behavior that pleases the Lord and is good for the child. That's what obedience is all about. It's not the parent saying, I'm the dominant person in this house and I will have everybody submit to me. That's not the point. Authority is supposed to be used for the benefit of the one you're in authority over. And so we have discipline, and we're trying to bring about obedient children, and a wise parent will vary their methods. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 11 compares about the discipline of a parent with the discipline of God the Father. And the point of the discipline is to bring about a good response in the life of the one who's being disciplined. And yes, it may be painful or uncomfortable, but a wise parent will look for a variety of methods depending upon the character and personality of the child that they're dealing with and the issue that's at hand. And so we don't have a one-size-fits-all for every child, nor for every circumstance. We should be looking and studying our children and understanding what is a good way to bring about the kind of behavior that we're trying to get at. And yes, sometimes the method that we choose has to be physical. And the Bible actually talks about this. I've listed 4 or 5 different places in the book of Proverbs that talks about this. And whether you use a wooden dowel or you use your hand, I don't know. I don't have any opinion about that. The point is that we're supposed to be using physical discipline, though, to achieve the proper outcome. Again, this is not an opportunity for the parent to inflict harm. That's not what we're talking about. But instead, we're trying to bring about an immediate negative consequence that grasps the attention of the child and causes them to want to turn. And this discipline should not have any lasting impact, right? No lasting physical impact. We're not talking about bruises or welts or anything like that. It's just enough in order to cause them to say, oh, that is a negative consequence of my behavior and I want to change it. Now, some people say, well, what's the youngest I should be bringing this kind of behavior into the life of my child? And I don't have an answer for that, but I can tell you that the point is that the child is supposed to make the connection between my behavior and this outcome, right? My behavior provoked this pain, and I'm going to not do this behavior in order to avoid that pain. Well, a really young child just simply doesn't have the mental function to be able to make that connection, to recognize that there are consequences that occurred from my behavior, and therefore I will change my behavior and avoid the consequences in the future. A really small child doesn't know that. You have to wait at least until the child can make that connection. Also, the amount of physical discipline should vary according to the age. A very young child is very fragile, and we must be very careful about bringing any kind of corporal punishment against a young child. Now, let's zoom forward a number of years, though, right? We don't want to be spanking an 18-year-old. That's entirely inappropriate. You wouldn't spank a 10-year-old. You probably don't ever need to spank a 6-year-old, right? We're probably talking about 5 and under, something like that. And again, any kind of physical discipline is modulated according to the ability of the child to receive that. The point is not for the parent to take out their anger. The point is not for the child to bear a wound. The point is to bring about a change in behavior. Now, what is the best way of having this done? Well, the best way is if you could capture the child's heart, right? If the child learns to love what you love and hate what you hate, so that when they get 5 or 6, we don't have to bring about any kind of physical response. Just having a negative word from mom and dad should be sufficient to cause the child greater remorse than any kind of physical discipline. You want the child to love to have your affirmation, so much so that a frown from you brings about the kind of response that you're looking for. If it takes physical discipline to get a child to change, by the time they're 18, what's going to happen to the child? They're going to end up in jail, right? If that's the only thing that stops them, then that's what's going to happen to them. We don't want that. We want a child that is trained, and trained because they want the parents' approval. And I would say the younger that you can develop that, the better. The parent is also responsible to give the child instruction. It says in Ephesians 6:4, bring the child up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So I think that this tells us that we are primarily responsible to pass on how to live a life that's pleasing to God, how to live a righteous life. It doesn't say you are responsible to make a rocket scientist out of your child. You can look through the whole scriptures, and I've said this before, you're not going to find it. But you are responsible to raise your child to know, and as best you can, to have them love the Lord. That's what it means to train your child in the instruction of the Lord. And so that's what's required of us. Now listen, I've also listed a number of passages from the Proverbs, and generally it's the first verse of every chapter for the first 7 or 8 chapters. And this is a repeated clause where King David tells his son Solomon, this is my instruction for you. Listen carefully to me, and hold on to what I have to say for you, because it will be a blessing. And Solomon's recounting, this is what my dad told me. Now this is what I'm telling you. And this is a good lead-in for what's happening this coming Sunday. We're starting a series in the book of Proverbs. And so I encourage young people, this is my admonition for you. I encourage you, come on Sunday mornings over the next couple of months, ready to receive what God has to lead you, teach you from the book of Proverbs. We're also required to model good behavior. We've Titus chapter 2 and 1 Peter chapter 5. This is instruction for leaders. But of course, mom and dad, you're leaders for your children. And so you're responsible to model good behavior. You can't say, well, I want good behavior out of my kids, but I don't do that. That's not something that I participate in, but I expect it of my children. That might last when they're very young, but eventually they're going to throw that off and they're going to say, well, that obviously wasn't good advice, wasn't good enough for them, so it's not going to be good enough for me. I'm just going to disregard that. So I think that we want to be very careful we model good behavior. And then finally, we're going to tell them of God. Look, what your children know about God, they're going to learn from you, at least in the first probably 10 to 11 years. They're going to learn it from you. And so that's our responsibility, to pass on to our children what we know about God. And this psalm, Psalm 78, is a really good chapter for that. And I would really encourage parents to dwell on this chapter. Related to this is the exhortation in Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is right after the giving of the Ten Commandments. And Moses says to the people, look, you are responsible to pass this on to your children. So I want you to tell it to them. And this is how I want you to tell it to them. Tell it to them when you're walking, and when you're sitting, and when you're sleeping, and when you're eating. I mean, this is a figurative way of saying, talk to them all the time about God. This should be on your lips all the time. This should be a topic that you're discussing all the time. It should be central in your family. And so that's our responsibility as parents, to tell them about God. Now up here in green, I've got 6 just phrases which I think are easy to remember and consequently to try to keep in my mind as I'm parenting. And so I've got provide, protect, prepare, lead, love, and discipline. And today we've talked about a few of these. Loving and discipline and preparing. Teaching would fall under preparing, and so on. And my word of wisdom, my word of advice about this is that these 6 should always be in balance, right? We don't want to overemphasize one. So we don't want to be really heavy in discipline, but fail to actually show any kind of love and affection to our children. And we don't want to be really heavy in providing for our families such that we're never there to lead them or prepare them, right? So we want these to be in balance in our lives. Provide, protect, prepare, lead, love, and discipline. Well, very good. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next week.